Welcome back. The story of my ancestors' treks and migrations is complex and often confusing. So let's start by reviewing where we left off in the last episode. Our elders migrated in search of new economic opportunities, but also to escape the constant threat of war in Eastern Europe, where they had seen generation after generation of their young men conscripted into the Austro-Hungarian army. For example, my great-grandparents Ferdinand and Katharina's son John, and their nephew, my mother's father, Franz, were among many in the family to serve mandatory 3-year terms, all during a time of relative peace, fortunately, but their fears of being pulled into a military conflict were well-founded. By 1904, when many of the family immigrated to Canada, trouble had been brewing for years. At the turn of the century, Bohemian and Serbian anarchists, among others, were assassinating nobles and blowing up post offices in protest against their Austro-Hungarian overlords. European monarchs were caught in a tangle of alliances, and when a rebel Serb, Gavrilo Princip, pulled a pistol and assassinated Archduke Ferdinand in Sarajevo, the dominoes fell, and his shot launched the First World War, ironically named the War to End All Wars. In this episode, we'll contrast the effects of this war on our settler ancestors in Saskatchewan with their families who remained in the Old Country. It's been 120 years since they arrived in Halifax, and today our North and South American relatives number in the thousands. So we could be forgiven for not knowing that most of our ancestors had chosen to remain in Europe. For example, my mother's father, Franz, was one of 7 children of Michael and Mariana Lang, of which only 3 emigrated: Franz, Lawrence, and Joseph. My father's grandfather, Ferdinand Lang, was the only immigrant among his 4 surviving siblings. When you consider that his brother George had 13 children, who then had their own families, who then also had families, and then consider that these don't include the siblings and children of their spouses, with names like Hartel, Hinger, and Hofmeister, you can begin to understand that we, as non-Europeans, are vastly outnumbered in our family by European relatives. So when Rudy Deitch chose a non-combatant role as a medic in World War II, saying that he did not want to be shooting his cousins, he was deadly serious. There were likely hundreds of our relatives fighting for Germany in the Second World War. And 3 decades earlier, when the First World War exploded in the fall of 1914, virtually all of our European relatives were right in the middle of it. Unlike most of their relatives far away in Saskatchewan. But even on these faraway prairies, their relative safety was not a given. The Old Country was now the enemy of their New Country, and the question of how to treat thousands of settlers fresh from the enemy's territories loomed ominously. Where did their loyalties lie? This question was not academic, because some settlers soon received conscription notices from Germany and its allies. My father commented on the issue in a 1983 videotaped interview.
All these people left here, whether it be from Austria or Germany or anywhere else, because we came to a country where there was no compulsory military service. There's in that Raymore Wallenstein book, the Miller family that were our neighbors there, you see, they came from Europe with 8 from Bohemia. They came from Bohemia with 8 grown children, and some of them were smaller, but 8 children, family of 8. And the mother came here against her wishes. And but when the war broke out, the 1914 war broke out, and the Austrian government sent these boys notice to serve in the military army of Austria in 1914. She was mighty glad that they were over here in Canada.
I'm sure Mrs. Miller had nothing to do with it, but the Canadian government opted to take no chances. It directed that immigrants arriving after 1902 could not enlist. And in August of 1914, acting in the wartime interests of national security, it passed the War Measures Act, which permitted the government to suspend the civil liberties of enemy aliens, conduct mass arrests, and set up internment camps. Ferdinand, Katharina, and their relatives and adult children were required to register as enemy aliens. Their firearms were confiscated, their right to vote was suspended, and accepting religious services, gathering in groups was prohibited, as was possession of German reading materials or speaking German in public. As draconian as these conditions were, our people were nevertheless fortunate to avoid the internment camps. Other German speakers, and especially Ukrainians, referred to as Austrians only because they had lived in the polyglot Austro-Hungarian Empire, were rounded up and sent to one of 24 work camps across Canada, where they were treated as prisoners of war. Ukrainian immigrants suffered the worst of it, making up more than half of the 8,579 immigrants who spent part of the war laboring on government projects across Canada. You may be surprised to learn that the Jasper and Banff town sites were constructed by Ukrainian internees. Their descendants continue to educate Canadians about this dark event in our history. As far as we know, our people avoided the camps and agreed peacefully to all terms. Ironically, being labeled as enemy aliens saved these settlers' sons from the dangers of war. And thus my great-uncles remained home to work the land, unlike the 74 young Raymore men who were gone for years, 8 of them forever, making the ultimate sacrifice. It is said that war is good for the economy, and it was exceedingly bountiful for the homesteaders. In decades since, good crops meant low prices, but serendipitously, yearly increases in crop production coincided with the rising price of wheat that climbed from $1 a bushel in 1914 to $2.51 in 1920, which would be $40 per bushel today, adjusted for inflation. Simply put, at the end of World War I, homesteaders in the Raymore area were earning 5 to 6 times per bushel of wheat than farmers are today. More money meant better equipment, new houses, automobiles, more land, and more production, and yet more money. And as Max Lang and his neighbors proudly paraded their new Ford cars to church on Sunday, their relatives in the old country were hurled into the bloody chaos that was World War I, the Eastern Front. Canadian history books are replete with stories about the Western Front, where German forces clashed with the French, English, Canadian, and American armies in a relentless trench war of attrition against the German army and Kaiser Wilhelm. Many of us are familiar with images of thousands of soldiers crouching among decaying corpses in a maze of muddy, rat-infested trenches, the suicidal charges toward the enemy lines into merciless machine gun fire. The enemy would then counterattack, reclaiming the same ravaged piece of wasteland with the same massive loss of lives. Over the course of the 4-year war, the Western front lines moved less than 100 kilometers in either direction, at the cost of 10 million lives. Of the fallen, 66,000 were Canadians and Newfoundlanders, roughly 10% of the 650,000 who served, which itself was nearly 10% of the entire population of Canada at the time. All news came from the Western Front, so our Sodbuster ancestors knew little about the war in the East, where their conscripted siblings and cousins served in the disorganized crazy quilt armies of Franz Joseph's Austro-Hungarian Empire, as it confronted the Tsarist Russians advancing from the east. Whereas Germany was united and strong, its Austro-Hungarian ally was old, tired, and weak, like its emperor, the beloved Franz Joseph. His 900,000 poorly equipped troops were no match for more than 1 million Tsarist Russians that stormed into Galicia on August 17, 1914. and approximately half of their armies advanced through our ancestral homeland, pouring into Bukovina and the peaceful little Smorzanka Valley. The Russians routed the Austrians, pushing them up the valley and into the Carpathian Mountains, where the line held for 9 months before Austrian forces regrouped and defeated the Russians at Gorlice and Tarnow in 1915. Of the 350,000 or so Austrian casualties, there were 100,000 dead, undoubtedly many from our family, including an Ernst Lang, conscripted from faraway Hesselsdorf, Bohemia. We know that 2 grandsons of my great-grandparents Michael Lang and Marianna Hofmeister were conscripted, Franz George, or Frank George, and his brother Michael, and grandmother Agatha's older brother, my great-uncle Wenzel Rice. Franz was the only one to return home. The following brief story of his ordeal was relayed to me by his son, Raymor's own Siegfried Lang. Franz was likely inducted into the Austro-Hungarian army around August 1914, and he was most likely captured in the retreat to the Carpathians in January of 1915 during one of the coldest winters in living memory. To make matters worse, convinced the war would soon be over, Austrian Chief of Staff General Konrad von Hötzendorf chose not to issue winter gear to his troops, who subsequently froze to death by the hundreds every day, according to official sources. Having escaped death, Franz was taken prisoner, and with thousands of his fellow soldiers relocated on foot and by train to Siberia, where he spent nearly 3 years in a prisoner of war camp, possibly Omsk. These gulags were hastily constructed in the Siberian wilderness. Death from injuries and disease was rampant, and food scarce. None had any idea when they might be released, if ever. And all were likely taken by surprise in late 1917, when their captors announced that all were free to leave, and common enlisted men were even invited to stay in Russia if they cared to. You see, while Franz was in camp, Russia erupted in a bloody revolution, with Vladimir Lenin leading a new communist regime that ended the authoritarian rule of the Romanov dynasty, finalized by executing Tsar Nicholas along with his entire family. Lenin had no interest in pursuing the Tsar's war, and neither did Austria's young Charles I, who inherited the throne from his uncle Franz Joseph when he died in 1916. On December 17, 1917, Russia and Austria signed an armistice, and the war in the East was over, nearly a year before it would grind to a bloody end in the West. Franz had no desire to stay in Russia and set out on foot for Felicienthal, thousands of perilous kilometers to the west. You see, the revolution was not entirely over, and the counter-revolutions in his path were killing millions of Ukrainians especially, whose leaders had no interest in communism. To survive, Franz drank water from puddles and stole food where he could find it. Bread cooling on a windowsill, for example. But the toll on his health and appearance was shocking, and when he arrived in Felicienthal, only his mother recognized him. His travails did not end with the war. After he lost a wife and 2 children to disease, he tried to join his cousins and uncles in Canada, but a pickpocket stole his ship ticket and cash. In desperation, he wrote to his Uncle Frank, my grandfather, to ask him for help. In return for passage, he promised to work for Frank and his brother Lawrence for a year. Which he did, which is likely why he was around for this photo at Grandpa Frank's house around 1929-30. Tragedies behind him, Frank married Barbara Beletsky, became a farmer, had several healthy children, including Siegfried, and died peacefully in 1971, aged 77. If, like me, you knew little about the war on the Eastern Front, we are not alone. Winston Churchill described it as the Forgotten War. Others called it the Unknown War. But it was all too well known and experienced by our European relatives. Many of the survivors, like Frank George, fled its aftermath, economic depression, and rampant inflation. Among those who sought a better life in Canada, Charles Fisher and John Geisbauer, while Wenzel Rice, Wenzel Hartel, and Anastasia Lang's families emigrated to Argentina, where they have thrived for the past century. The troubles continued for our relatives in the Śmierzanka Valley when Poland annexed western Galicia as part of the conditions of the Treaty of Versailles. According to the late Siegfried Lang, one day in 1925, the students in Felicienthal arrived at school to find a Polish teacher and all the textbooks in Polish, a language none of them spoke or wrote. However, for Czechs, Moravians, Bukovinans, Serbs, and others, the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire finally freed them from centuries of control by the German-speaking rulers. Calling World War I the war to end all wars was to become the greatest irony of the 20th century, when the draconian treaty conditions imposed on Germany served to fuel the rise of Hitler and set the stage for World War II, just 21 years later. And in Canada, unlike their parents' generation, many of our family's young men would willingly and by conscription join the fight for Canada against their cousins doing the same for Germany. In the months to come, I'll detail our family's involvement in World War II, but for now, it's time to lighten up and strike up the band. In the next episode, we explore our family's remarkable multi-generational musical heritage. Until then, thanks for watching.